I had been excited about this trip ever since January. That isn't an overstatement. I even marked it on my phone calendar with a small tent emoji. Which might sound silly, but that was exactly my headspace at the time. Work had been wearing me down steadily since autumn. The sort of gradual, relentless pressure where nothing explodes dramatically. It simply never lets up. Tucker suggested the idea in a text around Christmas. 3 days. A cabin just outside Pisgah. No real itinerary, only hiking trails, beer, and catching up on old times. I agreed before he even finished typing the sentence. We left Asheville around midday on Friday. Tucker was behind the wheel since it was his rental car. A silver Toyota Camry, whose interior carried the faint attempt to mask cigarette odor with vanilla air freshener. It hadn't fully succeeded. Lee sat in the front passenger seat, feet propped on the dashboard, headphones draped loosely around her neck. Not actually on her ears, just resting there. I was in the back seat with 2 duffel bags and a paper sack of snacks I had picked up from the Ingalls on Merriman before we departed. The drive took roughly 45 minutes. We exited the highway near Brevard and turned onto a county road that climbed into the hills, where the trees quickly pressed in tightly from both sides. Nothing theatrical, just suddenly present. Tucker had the address loaded on his phone. The cabin was advertised on one of those vacation rental platforms where the professional photographs make everything appear slightly nicer than reality. I had probably viewed the listing 6 times. Patience has never been my strong point. We reached it via a gravel road off Route 276 after a short drive through a cluster of hemlocks. The actual cabin was smaller than the pictures implied, which came as no surprise. Wooden siding, metal roof, a covered porch equipped with 2 Adirondack chairs, and a wooden bench someone had shoved against the railing. A rusted thermometer was nailed beside the door. It showed 62 degrees. That felt accurate. "This is perfect," Tucker declared. He said it in his usual manner, as though the matter was already settled and he was merely voicing confirmation. Lee stepped out, stretched, and gazed at the tree line for a moment before turning her attention to the cabin. I noticed the pause but kept quiet. I assumed she was simply absorbing the surroundings. Inside, the air carried the scent of cedar mixed with a hint of dust. The kitchen featured a 2-burner stove. The living area held a plaid sofa and a coffee table bearing a ring-shaped stain, and a short hallway led to 2 bedrooms. Tucker and Lee claimed the larger one. My room had a window overlooking the rear of the property and a bed with a green wool blanket neatly folded at the foot. I dropped my bag and sat on the mattress edge for a second. It was acceptable. Everything felt acceptable. We spent the remainder of the afternoon doing essentially nothing, which had been the entire purpose. Tucker discovered a Bluetooth speaker in a kitchen cabinet and paired it with his phone. Lee unpacked methodically, assigning every item its precise location, which is simply how she operates. I circled the porch twice, surveyed the yard, studied the tree line. The woods began perhaps 60 feet from the back of the cabin. They were thick, dense enough that visibility dropped to almost nothing after about 15 feet inside. By 5 o'clock we were on the porch with beers. Tucker held an Oscar blues pinner. Lee sipped a cider she had brought from home. I drank whichever IPA I had grabbed without checking the label. We remained seated as the sun sank behind the ridge and the light shifted from golden to neutral to completely gone. The temperature plunged quickly afterward. Tucker pulled on his fleece. Lee drew her jacket closer. No one suggested moving indoors. We discussed nothing of consequence. Tucker's job, which he felt lukewarm about. A college friend who had recently become engaged. The trail we planned to hike the following day. The type of conversation that wanders nowhere and doesn't need to. That was the entire evening. I finished half a bag of pretzels and experienced genuine relaxation for what felt like the first time in 2 months. I went to bed around 10:30. I have no idea of the precise time when I woke. My phone lay face down on the nightstand and I didn't reach for it. I simply remained still in the darkness and listened. The noise originated from the direction of the tree line. Low, rhythmic, intermittent. It continued for several seconds, paused, then resumed. The closest description I can give is something heavy being dragged slowly across dry leaves, purposeful rather than hurried. It maintained a steady rhythm. I stayed absolutely motionless. I sometimes do that when a sound wakes me, freeze and wait, as if remaining still might prevent whatever it is from noticing me. Probably not a practical reflex, but it's mine. I convinced myself it was deer. Deer pass through underbrush at night. They are heavier than most people realize. They pull their legs through leaf litter. I know this because I've researched it after hearing similar sounds in the dark before, which reveals something about my character. The noise mostly matched that pattern. It ceased after a few minutes. I lay there a bit longer, staring upward at the ceiling. The window was slightly open, letting in cold air that smelled of damp bark. Eventually, I rolled over and fell back asleep. In the morning, I said nothing about it. Tucker brewed coffee on the 2-burner stove while Lee sat at the kitchen table with her phone, and I filled a mug and stood by the window gazing into the backyard. The tree line appeared unchanged from the night before. Nothing looked disturbed as far as I could see. I considered checking, but decided against it. Tucker didn't mention anything. Neither did Lee. I figured if either of them had heard something unusual, they would have spoken up. Or perhaps they had done exactly what I did, rationalized it away and moved forward. Since no one brought it up, I didn't either. We simply drank coffee and decided on breakfast. Square Root in Brevard was Tucker's suggestion. It's on Main Street, a spot with exposed brick walls and a chalkboard menu. They play a blend of Americana and songs I didn't recognize. I ordered eggs and toast along with a second coffee. Lee chose a bowl of oatmeal with fruit and ate roughly half. Tucker ordered the full breakfast, finished every bite and talked non-stop about the trail. The Black Mountain Loop, around 6 miles, moderate elevation gain, excellent views from the higher sections. I had looked it up the previous night. We had tackled more difficult hikes before. It looked like a good Saturday plan. The drive back to the cabin and then to the trailhead took perhaps 20 minutes. The parking area was gravel with a handful of other vehicles already present. We began hiking around 10:30. The initial portion was straightforward. Well-maintained trail, clearly marked, the kind of walking where conversation flows easily without constantly watching your footing. We chatted. Tucker set a pace that was slightly quicker than necessary, which is typical for him. Lee followed behind him and I brought up the rear. At one point I stopped speaking and simply listened to the forest for a while, birds, wind moving through the upper canopy, our footsteps on the path. The views from the summit were impressive. We paused to eat the sandwiches we had packed, and Tucker snapped about 15 photographs. I sat on a flat rock, stared out at the ridgeline and thought about almost nothing. It was a pleasant hour. The descent was where things shifted. We were maybe a mile from the trailhead when we rounded a curve and entered it. For roughly 30 feet on both sides of the trail, someone had tied strips of cloth to branches at eye level. Pale, nearly off-white, a few almost gray. Each strip was knotted deliberately, not loosely. Tight, intentional knots that required effort. No breeze stirred in that section of trail, so they hung perfectly motionless, one after another, lining the way. We all halted simultaneously. Maybe a memorial, Tucker offered. People tie things to trees sometimes. Lee studied the strips for a long moment. That is what this feels like, Tucker shrugged. Then what does it feel like? She gave no reply. She simply continued walking straight through the middle without touching anything. I followed. The cloth pieces were close enough that I could have brushed them without fully extending my arm. I didn't. We emerged on the other side and kept moving. Tucker caught up and commented on the elevation we would regain on the return, and I responded, but the relaxed mood from earlier never fully returned. Not entirely. I continued walking. We reached the cabin a little after 4. Tucker was complaining about his boots, the insole chafing during the downhill, and I was only half listening. The porch steps were right there, and I was already imagining sitting still for a while. Lee stopped first. She was 2 steps ahead of me and simply froze, staring down at the mat. It was a black rubber grid mat with "Welcome" in raised, mostly worn letters. A folded piece of paper was tucked beneath the front edge, not protruding obviously, but concealed just enough to avoid immediate notice. Tucker picked it up before either of us spoke. He unfolded it, glanced briefly, then turned it toward us. It was a hand-drawn grid in pencil, perhaps 8 columns by 6 rows. Every cell contained a symbol, neither letters nor numbers, nothing familiar. Some were sharp geometric forms. Others resembled letters but weren't quite. One symbol appeared multiple times across different rows. The lines were precise. Whoever created it had taken care. "Huh," was all Tucker said. That single word summed up his entire response. He photographed both sides with his phone. The reverse was blank. He refolded it and handed it to me. I'm not sure why I accepted. It was standard printer paper, inexpensive grade, slightly softened from exposure to the outdoors. "Probably kids," Tucker suggested, "or some geocache thing. People leave items." Lee remained silent. She stared at the paper in my hand with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not fear, more like she was mentally processing something and disliked the conclusion. "You all right?" I asked. "Yeah." She went inside. Tucker watched her leave, then looked at me. "She's been quiet since the trail." "I know." He shrugged and followed her in. I lingered on the porch another minute, still holding the paper. I placed it on the small table beside the door, the one holding the citronella candle we never bothered to light. I didn't discard it. I don't know why I didn't discard it. Tucker began preparing dinner while Lee returned outside. She didn't sit. She stood near the railing with arms folded, not irritated, simply as though keeping something contained. She looked at me, then out toward the yard. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay." On the trail, there was someone standing among the trees. I waited. Roughly 50 feet off the path, completely motionless. I first noticed during the long descent before the switchbacks. She paused. At first I assumed it was another hiker who had stepped slightly off trail, perhaps resting. I didn't dwell on it, but about a quarter-mile later I glanced back. She stopped. They hadn't shifted at all. Same location, same posture, simply standing there observing us. I stayed quiet for a moment. The yard was dimming, that swift early evening gray typical of mountains. "You didn't mention it on the trail," I said. "I know. I kept telling myself I had misjudged the distance, that my memory was playing tricks." She gave a small head shake. It was, I believed her. That was the key point. Lee doesn't create drama. She's the type who will sit with discomfort for a long while before voicing it, and when she does, she has already examined it thoroughly. She had been a medical resident for 2 years. Her threshold for alarm was quite high. I went inside, retrieved my phone, and stepped back out. I searched for the Pisgah National Forest ranger station number. Found it on the 3rd result. It rang 4 times before someone answered. "Pisgah National Forest, Ranger Wilkins speaking." I explained as straightforwardly as possible. We were renting a cabin off Route 276. We hiked the Black Mountain Loop, observed a figure standing motionless in the trees off-trail, watching us. Also discovered a paper with unfamiliar symbols tucked under our welcome mat. There was a brief pause, not prolonged. "Thank you for reporting it," he replied. His tone was calm, practiced, the kind developed from years of reassuring anxious callers. "We've had no reported incidents in that vicinity lately. The trail has been quiet." "Okay," I said. "I should note there is a small religious community operating near the forest boundary. They've been present about 4 years. Entirely legal, they have all required permits. They occasionally leave markers along trails. Cloth, sometimes other materials. It's part of their custom." "Cloth markers," I repeated. "Correct. As for the figure," another short pause, "it could be one of their members. They travel through the area. They pose no threat to visitors." He delivered it in the manner of someone who is technically truthful yet deliberately incomplete. I've heard professors speak that way. Lawyers on television speak that way. There is a specific flatness to the delivery. "All right," I said. "Thank you. Have a pleasant evening. Call again if anything further arises." He disconnected first. I stood holding the phone. A religious community, trail markers. I glanced at the folded paper on the small table. Those were not trail markers, and the figure Lee described was not someone merely passing through. I returned inside and said little about the conversation. Tucker had pasta cooking, water boiling, and had already opened a bottle of red wine that was half empty by the time I sat. Lee had changed into a sweatshirt. The cabin felt warm inside, smelled of garlic, and for a short while it almost resembled an ordinary Saturday night. Tucker started a playlist. We ate. We discussed a mutual college friend who had recently gotten engaged to someone we hadn't met. Tucker refilled my glass without asking. It was fine, almost fine. Around 10 o'clock the porch light began flickering. It blinked twice rapidly, steadied, then flickered again. Tucker glanced upward, as though he could see the fixture through the ceiling. "Probably a loose bulb," he said, and stood from the table. He was outside perhaps 2 minutes. When he returned, he remained silent at first. He stood in the doorway, hands still on the frame, face a shade I had never seen on him before. "Come see this," he said quietly. We stepped out. The porch light was steady now. Directly beneath the fixture, perfectly centered on the boards as though measured, sat 12 stones arranged in a circle. Not gravel, not miscellaneous rocks, smooth, uniformly sized stones, evenly spaced, forming a precise circle roughly 2 feet across. Someone had placed them individually while we sat 10 feet away eating pasta and talking about a wedding. No one spoke for some time. Tucker crouched and examined them without touching. Lee stood with arms at her sides. I looked from the circle to the tree line, now just dark outlines. I recalled the ranger's voice, that distinctive flatness. I thought of the paper waiting inside on the table. I didn't voice what was in my mind. I already understood it wasn't coincidence. We went back inside. Tucker shut the door behind us. I watched him check the latch twice, unconsciously, almost mechanically. That was new behavior. Lee was already at the table. The paper with symbols lay in front of her. She regarded it the way she regards things when she has reached a firm conclusion and is only waiting for the proper moment to speak. I've known her long enough to recognize the look. Tucker sat across from her. I remained standing near the counter. "I need to tell you something," she said. Tucker placed both hands flat on the table. "Okay." She indicated one symbol near the center of the grid, not the bold one at the top, but a smaller angular shape bisected by a diagonal line. "I've seen this before," she said. "Not something similar, this exact design." Tucker examined it. "Where?" "On a patient," she answered. Last spring, Mission Hospital. She has worked at Mission in Asheville for about 2 years. I knew that much. What I didn't know was what she was about to reveal, because she paused deliberately, as though weighing how much detail to share. He arrived unresponsive, she continued. Brought by ambulance. No identification, no family, no one accompanying him. Physically, he was mostly stable. No acute issues we could detect, yet he responded to nothing. Not pain, not light, not voice. He simply lay with eyes open. Tucker said, like a coma. No, he tracked. His eyes followed movement. He was present inside, he just wouldn't speak. She paused again. He never spoke, not a single word during his entire admission. That detail landed strangely. Not impossible, but odd. How long was he there? I asked. 4 days, she replied. We performed every test, neurology consult, psychiatry consult, toxicology panel. Nothing explained it. When food was placed before him, he ate. When assisted, he stood and walked. But he never spoke, never answered questions, never acknowledged anyone else's presence in the room. She looked again at the paper. He had that symbol tattooed on the inside of his left wrist. Exact proportions, same diagonal line. No one spoke for a moment. When discharged, she went on, he rose independently, dressed himself, walked to the door. A nurse attempted to stop him for a signature on discharge forms. He moved around her. She said he didn't push, didn't even look at her, just bypassed her as though she didn't exist. Lee folded her hands. After he left, they found a folded piece of paper on his pillow. She tapped the paper on the table, folded the same way as this one. Tucker leaned back. I could see him searching for the angle that would make the implication less alarming. He's usually skilled at that. This time he stayed silent. Did you keep the hospital paper? I asked. No, she said. I probably should have. I didn't. She met my eyes. I tried to forget the whole encounter honestly. It unsettled me in a way I couldn't articulate. And I don't like things I can't articulate, so I filed it away. That is Lee. She doesn't frighten easily. When something does disturb her, she archives it and continues. The fact that she was retrieving this particular memory now, at this table, with that paper between us and 12 stones arranged in a circle outside on the porch, that told me more than the story alone. Tucker suggested it might be coincidence. Lee looked at him without speaking. I'm only saying symbols recur. Religious imagery, folk traditions, overlap exists constantly. The ranger mentioned a community nearby. Some man in Asheville has a tattoo. It doesn't necessarily, Lee spoke quietly. That's all. He stopped. We sat in silence for a while. I don't recall if we discussed anything afterward. At some point, Tucker turned off most lights except the one above the sink, and we went to bed. I lay on top of the covers fully clothed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the cabin creak and the trees outside, and nothing distinct, just the entire property seeming to wait for a sound I couldn't identify. I didn't sleep. Sunday arrived gray. I was already perched on the bed's edge when faint light began filtering through the thin curtain. My eyes felt parched. I had been awake long enough that exhaustion had passed into a kind of empty alertness. Tucker attempted to start the car shortly after 8. I heard it from inside. The engine turned over and died. He tried again. Same result. Again. I stepped onto the porch and watched him attempt it 4 more times. It would catch for perhaps 2 seconds, then quit cleanly, as though someone had yanked a plug. That isn't the battery, I said. I know, he replied. He phoned a tow service in Brevard. The woman on the line estimated 2 hours minimum, possibly closer to 2.5. Tucker accepted and returned inside. We made coffee and avoided discussing the car much. Lee sat at the table with her phone. I drank coffee standing. After a while, I went outside. I told myself I only wanted fresh air. Mostly true, yet since waking I had been thinking about the property's boundaries, the areas we hadn't explored. The cabin sat in a clearing. The yard extended perhaps 60 feet before meeting the tree line. We had stayed on the porch, hiked the trail, driven the car. We hadn't walked the full perimeter. I started along the left side, past the propane tank and the untouched woodpile. The grass there was longer, uncut recently, still wet from overnight. My trail runners were soaked within 30 seconds. I continued. The rear boundary of the yard ended where mowed grass gave way to ground cover, ferns and low brush before the trees. I followed that transition line to the right, hands in pockets, not searching for anything particular. About 2/3 of the way across the back I found it. A shallow trench, perhaps 8 or 10 inches deep, roughly 40 feet long, running parallel to the tree line. The soil was dark and freshly disturbed, mounded in a low ridge along one side. Not erosion, not animal digging. Someone had excavated it recently. The earth remained loose, edges hadn't yet compacted or dried. I stood staring at it. Then the smell reached me. Not overpowering, not dominant, but present beneath the wet soil and leaf scent. Something else. Most people recognize that odor even from 1 or 2 encounters. It lingers in memory. It isn't easily confused. Something lay buried there. I remained motionless for a full minute, perhaps longer. I studied the trench, then the tree line behind it, and remembered the ranger's flat tone on the phone, the circle of stones on the porch, the man from the hospital who walked away without signing discharge papers. Then I turned and walked back to the cabin. Tucker was refilling his coffee when I entered. Lee remained at the table. Neither looked up. I said nothing. I sat, lifted my own mug, gazed out the window at the yard, and waited for the tow truck. The truck arrived around 10:30. Tucker had requested an 11 o'clock window, so the early arrival stood out. Not critical, but noticeable. It approached slowly up the gravel drive, a white flatbed with Stevens Towing stenciled in faded blue on the door. I was still at the table with coffee when I heard tires on gravel and rose to look. The truck stopped about 20 feet from the porch and idled. No one exited. Tucker set down his mug. That's him. We stepped onto the porch. The driver's window lowered and a heavy-set man leaned out, one thick forearm resting on the door. Gray-brown hair, broad reddened face, small dark eyes that scanned the property methodically. He looked at the cabin, the yard, the tree line, then at us. "You called for a tow," he stated, not a question. "Yeah," Tucker answered, "car's right here." The man didn't move. He scanned the property once more, the same deliberate sweep, then looked back at us. "Car, going to the shop," he said. "You're riding with me." Tucker gave a short laugh. "We can follow you. It's fine, we have." "You're riding with me," he repeated. Identical flat tone, identical expression. That was it. No justification, no softening, just the sentence twice. I glanced at Tucker. Tucker glanced at me. The driver, Lloyd Stevens, according to the door, simply waited. He carried the demeanor of someone who had already determined the next 10 minutes and felt no need to negotiate. "Okay," I said. "Give us a few minutes to gather our things." Lloyd Stevens regarded me briefly. "Don't take long." We returned inside. Tucker immediately began gathering his hiking pack, camera bag, cooler he had brought from home. Lee moved quietly and efficiently, picking up her jacket and phone from the table. I grabbed my keys and wallet. That was essentially all for me. I travel light. It's a habit. "I'm not leaving my camera gear here," Tucker said. He stood in the center of the living room, staring at his belongings as though calculating. "It'll be fine," I said. "We'll come back for everything." "Will we?" I had no solid reply. I started to mention calling the rental company to sort it out, but Lee gripped Tucker's arm firmly enough to silence him mid-sentence. She pointed toward the tree line. I looked. The figure stood there, same distance, perhaps 50 feet from where yard met trees. Same utter stillness, yet not in the identical position. Yesterday it had been farther left, nearer the property corner. Now it stood centered directly behind the cabin, aligned with the back door. It had shifted. Not far, but noticeably. Tucker stopped mentioning camera gear. After that, he simply picked up his jacket and keys. We walked out the front door and climbed into Lloyd Stevens' truck. Lee in the middle, Tucker by the window, me on the outside. The cab smelled of diesel and stale coffee. A Wendy's bag lay on the floor looking weeks old. Lloyd Stevens said nothing as we entered. He shifted into gear and began loading the car onto the flatbed. We watched through the windshield. He worked efficiently, never glanced back at the cabin, never checked the tree line, just performed the task. Once the car was secured, he returned, turned the truck around on the gravel, and drove down the drive. I watched the cabin in the side mirror until trees closed over the road and it vanished. After several minutes of silence, I asked, "How did you know the address?" Lloyd Stevens glanced over. "What?" "The address. Tucker gave it to dispatch when he called. But you arrived early, so I'm wondering how you already knew where to come." He stayed quiet a moment. The road was narrow. He kept his eyes forward. "Been called to that cabin 3 times in the past 18 months, he said. I waited. "Different renters each time," he continued. "Same issue every time." Tucker asked, "What issue?" Lloyd Stevens didn't respond. He kept driving. I looked at Tucker. Tucker looked at Lee. Lee stared straight ahead, face perfectly calm, which by then I recognized as the opposite of calm. No one questioned Lloyd Stevens further. He offered nothing more. We rode the rest of the way to Brevard with windows closed, radio silent, Wendy's bag rustling on the floor at every curve. The shop sat on Brevard's south side, a gray cinderblock building with 2 bays and a gravel lot. Hernandez Auto, hand-painted on a board above the door. One other vehicle in the lot, an old Subaru on stands. Lloyd Stevens backed the flatbed in and began unloading. He didn't accompany us inside. The mechanic was a lean man in gray coveralls. Name Patch Red Billy. Short dark hair streaked with grease, narrow face. He regarded us the way people do when they want to signal no interest in talking. He took the keys from Tucker wordlessly and pulled the car into the bay. We waited about 20 minutes. The waiting area held 2 plastic chairs and an unplugged coffee maker. I checked my phone. Tucker texted someone. Lee stood by the bay door watching Billy Hernandez work. He raised the hood and leaned inside. After perhaps 2 minutes, he straightened and beckoned me over. "Just me," I said, and approached. He pointed beneath the hood. A wire ran from the battery area toward the engine block. It was severed, clean cut, both ends separated by about an inch. No fraying, no corrosion, no wear, sliced as though with cutters or a blade. The rubber insulation showed sharp edges on both sides. "Ground wire," he said. I looked. "Okay. Car won't run without it." "Right," I met his eyes. "Who cuts a ground wire?" He didn't answer. He retrieved a replacement wire from somewhere in the back, installed it in about 15 minutes, then drove the car out of the bay and left it idling in the lot. He went inside to prepare the invoice, $400. He handed me the slip without eye contact. I paid by card. He returned the receipt, placed the keys on the counter between us. That was all. No explanation, no speculation about how it happened, no suggestion to speak with anyone. He simply set the keys down and stared at the wall behind me. I picked them up. Tucker and Lee waited outside. I lingered 1 extra second. "Thanks," I said. Billy Hernandez nodded once and walked back into the bay. Tucker leaned against the passenger door when I exited the shop, arms crossed, gazing at nothing in particular. Lee stood a few feet away, jacket zipped to the chin despite the mild temperature. "We good?" Tucker asked. "Yeah," I replied. "Ground wire, huh?" He pushed away from the car. "Weird." I said nothing in response. I unlocked the doors and we got in. The drive back to Asheville takes about 40 minutes on Route 64, mostly two-lane highway winding through mountains, occasional curves, small towns that pass quickly. I've driven it before. It's normally scenic. I kept the speed around 60 and tried not to overthink the road. Tucker sat in the passenger seat. 10 minutes in he started music, something quiet and unmemorable, and stared out the window. I doubt he saw much. Lee was in the back. Within the first 5 minutes I noticed she wasn't facing forward. She sat turned slightly, not fully but enough, watching out the rear window. I could see her in the mirror. She wasn't being obvious. No craning neck, no theatrics. Just sitting at a subtle angle, eyes fixed steadily on the road behind us, calm and silent. I said nothing. I had no idea what to say. "See anything?" Probably not the right question. She maintained that position for most of the drive. I kept glancing at the mirror, not because I expected something behind us, but because she was there and impossible to ignore. The road remained ordinary. A few other vehicles, a truck hauling a tarp trailer near Rosman. Nothing unusual. Tucker said, "I'll contact the rental company tomorrow." "Okay," I answered. "They probably have a procedure for this. Likely happens more often than you'd think." I didn't reply to that. I wasn't certain what procedure he imagined. I wasn't even sure how to describe what this actually was to a rental agency. "We left most of our stuff behind," he said. "Yeah, my good sleeping bag is still there." Lee stayed silent. I focused on the road. Tucker let the topic drop. He returned to staring out the window. The music continued, guitar notes that wandered without resolution. I lowered the volume slightly. He didn't object. We reached Asheville around 4:30. The late afternoon mountain light slanted sideways and flattened everything, giving the world a faintly washed-out appearance. I took Merriman Avenue toward their neighborhood. Tucker and Lee rent an old craftsman house off Kimberly. Nice street, large trees. I pulled up in front. Tucker opened his door before I fully stopped. He stepped out, stretched, and looked at their house as though verifying it still existed. Lee exited more slowly. She stood on the sidewalk and glanced back down the street for just a second. Then she looked at me through the open door. "Thanks for driving," she said. "Sure." She held my gaze a moment longer, as though considering whether to add something. She didn't. She shut the door and walked toward the house. Tucker leaned back in through the passenger side. "I'll text you," he said. "We'll sort out the cabin things." "Sounds good." He paused. "And hey, it was still mostly a good trip." I nodded. He closed the door and jogged up to join Lee at the porch. She already had keys ready. I watched them enter. The door shut. I sat there perhaps 30 seconds. I'm not sure why. Then I pulled away and drove home. My apartment is on the north side of town, about 15 minutes from their place. Second floor of a house on Chestnut. 1-bedroom, undersized kitchen. Window above the sink overlooking the neighbor's fence. I've lived there 3 years. It's acceptable. I arrived home around 5. I set my bag by the door and left it unpacked. I poured a glass of water and stood in the kitchen drinking it. The apartment felt quiet in the particular way it does after I've been away a few days, like it has carried on independently and become slightly unfamiliar. Around 6, I cooked eggs and ate them standing at the counter because sitting at the table felt unnecessary. Washed the pan, put it away. Tucker didn't text. I checked my phone around 7. Nothing. Checked again around 8:30. Still nothing. That was okay. He was probably exhausted, probably handling Lee or the rental company issue or simply unwinding. That was okay. Around 9, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and a beer I didn't truly want and attempted to focus on something else. Work. A project awaited me Monday morning. I thought about it for perhaps 2 minutes before it slipped away. My mind kept returning to the trail. Not the figure, not the porch stones, not the trench, not Lloyd Stevens idling in his truck without stepping out. It kept circling back to the cloth strips, the pale, tightly knotted ones tied at eye level to branches along that section of path on the descent. Specifically, I kept trying to determine the sequence, whether they had been present during our morning ascent or appeared afterward and were only there on the return. I replayed it. We parked at the trailhead around 10, walked upward. The Black Mountain Loop climbs first then descends, so we ascended first. I concentrated on timing, on what I saw when, and felt fairly certain I hadn't noticed the strips on the way up. Fairly certain we would have commented if we had. Tucker would have, or Lee would have, yet no one did, so they weren't there during ascent. Then I replayed it again and grew less certain because there's a portion on the climb where the trail crosses a south-facing slope and trees thin. I was mostly watching my footing. Tucker led. Lee followed. I wasn't scanning branches. I could have passed right by them. So perhaps they were present. Perhaps I simply overlooked them. Third replay. Same outcome. Different outcome. I couldn't settle it. That isn't abnormal. Memory doesn't function like video footage. No pristine replay exists. Details fade, especially during motion and inattention. That's standard, but this didn't feel like ordinary forgetting. That was the difficulty I couldn't overcome. Ordinary forgetting leaves gaps, missing segments you recognize as absent. This felt different. Each replay produced a complete version, just not the same version. Both felt equally authentic. One where the strips existed on the ascent. One where they didn't. Every attempt yielded a full recollection, just inconsistent. I sat at the kitchen table a long time with that thought. The beer grew warm. I didn't finish it. Outside, a car passed on Chestnut, headlights swept across the ceiling and vanished. I kept replaying. I couldn't stop. Not because it would change anything. Not because it altered the rest of the weekend's events. Simply because I couldn't make it hold still. The cloth strips, the branches, the light filtering through trees, whether we had already passed them or encountered them fresh on the descent, I couldn't lock it in place. And the longer I dwelled, the less it resembled forgetting at all. I finally stood and placed the beer in the sink. Didn't empty it, just set it there. I don't know why that felt like a choice, but it did. The kitchen stayed quiet. My apartment sits on the second floor of a building on Chestnut and is usually peaceful after midnight. Only occasional cars, the refrigerator humming at 2 in the morning. I stood at the counter a minute staring at the table as though I might return to it. Then I didn't. I moved to the window instead. Nothing outside. Streetlight, a parked Subaru with a broken tail light, the laundromat across the street with its sign still glowing. Ordinary Sunday night. I stood there longer than necessary. What kept resurfacing wasn't the figure in the trees. It wasn't the trench. I had spent most of the drive back from Brevard thinking about the trench, about that smell, about what mental gymnastics were required to keep driving and say nothing to Tucker and Lee. I performed plenty of mental gymnastics on that drive. Deer, natural death, perhaps a garden, though no one plants a 40-foot line garden at the rear of a rental cabin. I ran through possibilities, none stuck. Eventually, I stopped running through them and concentrated on the road. But the trench was what kept me awake. I returned to the table, sat again, pulled out my phone, and opened the photos Tucker had taken of the paper, the grid of symbols. He sent them to the group chat Friday night, back when it still felt like a quirky trip incident rather than something to sit alone with at 2 in the morning. I studied them for a while. The symbols meant nothing to me, still don't. I set the phone face down, the cloth strips, that was the core, that was the element. I had approached it from every angle possible. I tried anchoring to the light. I remembered the light lower on the descent, more orange striking trees at a different angle than during ascent. That detail felt solid, so if I could position the strips relative to the light, the timeline would clarify, but every attempt allowed both versions. Strips in orange descent light, strips in flat afternoon ascent light. Both appeared equally valid. I tried the walking order. Tucker usually led on trails because he sets pace and rarely notices when others lag. Lee stayed in the middle. I brought up the rear. That remained consistent, so I tried recalling what I saw when I first noticed the strips. Whether I looked past Lee at something Tucker had already passed, or whether I spotted them first, that should have been a fixed reference. Being last, if the strips existed on ascent, Tucker would have entered them first. I tried remembering any reaction from him. Nothing came. I had one version where he paused and commented, another where no one spoke until Lee pointed, another where I spoke first. 3 distinct versions, all complete, none clearly incorrect. I tried recalling our conversation. We talked most of the hike, ordinary catching up. I remembered a stretch where Tucker discussed work, a delayed project. I remembered Lee laughing at something. Neither moment anchored relative to the strips. Could have been before, could have been after. I stood and poured a glass of water, drank half at the sink. Normal forgetting announces itself. There's a gap. You were present, then absent. The middle vanishes and you feel the absence. I forget plenty. I'm not blessed with exceptional recall. I misplace keys 4 times a week, forget names. I once lost the entire second half of a sophomore year road trip because illness blurred everything. This wasn't that. This was the reverse. Too much memory, not too little. Each reach for the sequence returned a complete version. The issue wasn't absence. The issue was 2 full versions occupying the same mental space, and I couldn't evict one. I sat again. The refrigerator hummed for a while, then silenced. I thought of Lee watching the rear window the entire drive home. I thought of Tucker promising to text and then not texting. I thought of Lloyd Stevens in his truck cab, hands on the wheel, engine running, never stepping out, never opening the door, just surveying the property with those small dark eyes as though he had already classified the place and required no further confirmation. 3 calls in 18 months, different renters each time, same problem each time. I considered what that implied. I considered it for a while, then stopped because no useful path emerged. Some questions yield answers when turned over long enough. Some remain the same shape no matter how long you hold them. My phone still lay face down on the table. I turned it over. No new texts. Tucker's final group chat message was from Saturday afternoon, a photo of his hiking boots on the trail with a silly caption. Lee had reacted with a thumbs up. That was the thread's last activity. I set the phone down again. The cloth strips on branches in that 30-foot stretch of trail. Pale, knotted at eye level, lining both sides of the path. Whoever placed them understood the trail, knew where hikers would pass, knew the correct height to make them unavoidable. That part was certain. The uncertain part was timing, whether they hung during our first pass or appeared while we hiked higher and awaited us on return. And I couldn't resolve it. I had sat in my kitchen 3 hours attempting to resolve it and failed. What troubled me most, what I kept returning to no matter how many replays, was that it didn't feel arbitrary. Ordinary forgetting feels arbitrary. Details drop randomly for no reason. This felt deliberate. This single detail, this one sequence that would reveal how long we had been observed and from what distance, That was the element refusing to stabilize. Not the figure, not the stones, not the symbol Lee recognized from the silent hospital patient who departed unsigned. The cloth strips, their order just that. I remained there until the sky outside began graying at the edges. Not dawn yet, just diminished darkness. I watched it happen through the window without conscious decision. At some point, I rested my head on my arms at the table and closed my eyes. I didn't sleep. I simply stopped struggling to understand. That was the most I could manage. I stayed that way, eyes closed, while the kitchen gradually brightened around me, and I allowed the weekend to rest behind me, unresolved. All of it, the sounds, the symbols, the smell from the trench, the unmoving figure in the trees. I let it keep its shape. The cloth strips, though, I couldn't entirely release them. They remain whenever I remember, which still happens sometimes late at night when the apartment is silent and sleep won't come. Both versions, both complete. Both equally real. I still cannot tell you which one occurred.